All right. Good morning, everyone. It's good to be back. My thanks to Jason and Jason for filling in while I was gone. They both did a great job, I heard. So we finished up 1 Corinthians, and then we had some kind of one-off sermons. And this morning, we're going to be starting a series in Samuel. And we're at least going to do 1 Samuel, maybe take a break between 1st and 2nd. But they're originally one literary work, right? They weren't originally intended to be divided, 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel. They're just one thing. It's a little different than like the epistles, which are written as like, here's the first letter, and here's the second letter. And they're to the same people, but they're not meant to be like sequels necessarily, anything like that. So Samuel was originally intended to be one literary work. And it's not written by Samuel either. It's named after him because he's kind of the central figure at the beginning of it, at least, in getting things going. But and certainly probably drew from some of his sources, but also sources like Nathan and Gad, and even King David's official records. But Samuel is not the author, and we don't actually know who the author is. The author is anonymous. And we're not sure who the actual author was. The exact date of writing is also difficult to nail down. It was likely written sometime between 1025 BC and 900 BC during King David's lifetime and a little bit after. But again, it's difficult to know exactly when that might have been. But the historical setting is pretty easy for us to know. And these are all context things that are important for us to know before we dive into any book of the Bible, is kind of know where are we diving in, right? If you just took a Bible and flipped it open and started reading, there's a good chance you're going to be confused, right? There's a good chance you're going to hit something where you're like, I don't know what's going on. I don't know who these characters are. I don't know where we're at in history. And so it's important for us to know before we dive in kind of what is the historical setting that we're at and where are we at in the story of the Bible at large. So if we go from the beginning, right, we have the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. That tells us our history from creation up in through the Exodus from Egypt, and then all the way up to the banks of the Jordan before Israel's about to cross into the Promised Land. Right, that's what Deuteronomy is. The last of the Pentateuch: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is Moses telling the Israelites, here's what to do when you go into the Promised Land, because he's not going with them. Then we get the book of Joshua, which tells us about the conquest of the Promised Land. As the Israelites go into the Promised Land, Joshua leads them, and he leads them in battle as they're going into the Promised Land. The book of Joshua tells us about that. And then Judges tells us about the first kind of 300 years of Israel being in the Promised Land. And they're surrounded by all these other nations, and they're having to fight some battles and things like that. And there's all these things going on. About 300 years of the book of Judges covers. And Judges are the ones who are kind of ruling, right? They're not exactly like a monarch, but they're not elected either. They're kind of spiritual leaders, military leaders, generally overseeing things. You have these series of judges for the first 300 years. And then the next book is the book of Ruth, which is kind of a one-off story. And then you have Samuel. And Samuel is going to take us from the beginning of the ministry of Eli the priest. And it's going to take us all the way through King David's reign. And it really tells us about the start of the monarchy as Israel is beginning to get a monarchy. And it's really what their desire is, as we'll see as we go into this. But religiously, Israel is at a low point, right? We'll find that even the priesthood is corrupt, but there is a righteous remnant, a small group of Israelites who are faithfully worshiping Yahweh at Shiloh. They're still going, even though overall Israel is not doing well religiously. Politically, Israel is starting to get jealous of their neighbors, right? So if we consider this space, right, the Middle East, and where modern-day Israel is where the Promised Land is, where they're residing at this point. There are kind of all these other nations in and around where Israel is at. And they're not that big. They're kind of similar to Israel. It's who God warned Israel about when they went into the promised land. Hey, don't mix with these nations because they're doing evil things, right? They're worshiping all these demon gods. They're doing things like child sacrifice and all these horrible things. And you need to stay separate from them so that you don't get influenced and start worshiping those gods and start doing all these evil things. So stay separate from them. There are all these little nations, but there are also the big dogs. The big dogs in this region are Egypt, which is where modern-day Egypt is, and Assyria or Babylon, right? They kind of change names as we go through Scripture, but that's up in Mesopotamia, where modern-day Iraq is. These two big nations, they rule the stage, and whenever either of them are powerful, all these small nations have to worry about those nations. But at this point, they're not that powerful. As Israel is coming into this period we're talking about Samuel, they're not that powerful. They're kind of at a weak state. So all these other nations have some room to grow, including Israel. Israel's big foe internationally is the Philistines, right? As we'll see, the Philistines are going to be the big primary combatants with Israel as we go through the book of Samuel. And they're pretty evenly matched with Israel, but the big advantage that they have is that they have a monopoly on iron, which gives them a military advantage. But one thing Israel is noticing that they lack, that everybody else has, is a king. Now, this is something that is going to be difficult for us to understand as a country founded on not wanting a king, right? That Israel wanted a king very badly because that gave you status as a nation, right? You have a king, you are a real nation, you're a grown-up nation. If you don't have a king, you're just like some tribe or something, who cares? Right? Who is even going to represent you? You don't have anything. So Israel wants a king because they don't have one. So this is it. We're at a transition point for Israel. And Samuel himself, as we get into who he is what we would say is the last judge. So from the period of judges, he's the last of the judges. And then he's the first kind of prophet. Because Israel will go into a period of having kings and prophets, and Samuel represents that transition. He's the last judge and the first prophet. All right, so we'll dive in here to 1 Samuel chapter 1, verses 1 through 8. Don't feel like you need to have remembered all that because we will certainly bring it up as it becomes applicable. 1 Samuel chapter 1, verses 1 through 8. There was a certain man of Ramathaim Zophim of the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, the son of Jeroham, son of Elihu, son of Tohu, son of Zuph, an Ephrathite. He had two wives. The name of the one was Hannah, and the name of the other Peninnah. And Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. Now this man used to go up year by year from his city to worship and to sacrifice to Yahweh of hosts at Shiloh, where the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were priests of Yahweh. On the day when Elkanah sacrificed, he would give portions to Peninnah his wife and to all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah he gave a double portion because he loved her, though Yahweh had closed her womb. And her rival used to provoke her grievously to irritate her, because Yahweh had closed her womb. So it went on year by year. As often as she went up to the house of Yahweh, she used to provoke her. Therefore Hannah wept and would not eat. And Elkanah, her husband, said to her, Hannah, why do you weep, and why do you not eat? And why is your heart sad? Am I not more to you than 10 sons? Okay, so let's talk about Elkanah for a minute. Elkanah is this guy, a certain man. And we read about his introduction here. It sounds very impressive, doesn't it? It sounds like really, he's a big deal, right? Like Elkanah, a certain man of Ramathaim Zophim of the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, son of Jeroham, son of Elihu, son of Tohu, son of Zuph, an Ephrathite. Whoa, that's pretty big. I'm just Chris from Cameron Park, right? That's not a big deal, right? But in reality, you're not supposed to be impressed, right? He's just giving genealogy, he's giving general location, but he's just a guy, right? He's not special. It's not like you go, oh, wow, look at his genealogy. Look at where he lives. Like, whoa, this is incredible. No, he's just an average guy in Israel, just going about his business. He seems that he isn't special, but he is a faithful worshiper of Yahweh, right? That's the thing that should stand out, is that he is part of that righteous remnant that we talked about. This small group of Israelites who are still being faithful, still worshiping Yahweh as they were taught by their forefathers. He's making the sacrifices. He's going up year by year from his city to worship Yahweh of hosts at Shiloh. And these would include the sacrifices that he and his family would receive a portion of to eat. So if you remember, when we studied all the sacrifices in Leviticus, there are some sacrifices that they would receive a portion of, and they would have a meal, essentially a communal fellowship meal with God, and that would be part of the sacrificial process. That's what he talks about here when he says he gives portions. And he gives portions to his two wives, right? Elkanah, like a lot of his forefathers, was a polygamist. He has two wives, Hannah and Peninnah. Hannah was likely Elkanah's first wife, and it seems clear that she couldn't conceive a child, and so that's why they end up bringing in a second wife. Right? It's a common solution to this problem at this time period. Right? It's not as though they could take Hannah to the fertility clinic and have some tests run and have some things done, or all the different things that they can do nowadays to help someone have a child. They didn't have anything like that. Their best option was, we're going to have to bring in a second wife. And so they bring in Peninnah. She has lots of kids, right? It doesn't even tell us how many, just that she has sons and daughters. She's got multiple kids with Elkanah, and Hannah's still there. Elkanah clearly had a special place in his heart for Hannah. It seems, again, that they're evenly matched, right? They seem to have truly loved one another. It's probably the wife of Elkanah's youth, right? They probably met in a more common way, had a bit of romance, had some passion. They were evenly matched. Peninnah was probably younger, brought in later on to have children. Not that Elkanah wouldn't have cared for her, but he has a special place in his heart for Hannah. They'd been through that disappointment together, right? They'd borne that together. They loved each other. And so Elkanah tries to show that love when they're giving the portions from the sacrifices. He gives some to everybody, but he gives a double portion to Hannah. He gives her twice as much. But Hannah and Peninnah, they don't get along, right? It says that Peninnah actively provoked Hannah's jealousy, right? She actively tried to bring that on, right? Probably because she felt less loved, right? There's an easy problem we can see here, that Hannah is actively, passionately loved by Elkanah. Peninnah is not, but she's got all these children, so she's got to flaunt that, right? Out of the pain that she feels of not being as loved, she's going to flaunt that and show that off. And you can imagine what that might have looked like, right? Like, Elkanah, we need some more meat over here. You know, my third son, he's a big eater. So maybe we could get some more of that meat over here, right? And kind of flaunting that, showing that off, while Hannah is sitting there. She's so upset that she can't even eat. And this is a continual problem, right? Notice that this isn't just a one-time incident. We read about it here, and you can imagine that scene, right? You can imagine it, but this is not just a one-time thing. This is something that's going on all the time. It's highlighted at this special family time of sacrifice where they go up. You know, it's like any problems that happen in your own families, right? They're bigger at the holidays, right? They're always there, but like those problems tend to really shine at big family gatherings and when things are going on in the holidays. That's what's happening here. That they're feeling that more so when they go up to do this, to worship. But notice verse 7. So it went on year by year. This is not just a one-time thing. This is something that's happening year after year after year. And you can imagine probably some years Peninnah was pregnant when they went, which would be an extra dagger, right? There's more children every year when they go. Hannah is feeling more and more the weight of this thing that she's feeling that she lacks. And it doesn't matter what, Elkanah can't make it better, right? He's giving her a double portion, but it doesn't matter. And he even tries to say, am I not more to you than 10 sons? It doesn't make a difference. So here's a moment where you might pause and say, like, why is there so much polygamy in the Old Testament? From people that we're supposed to be like learning from, right? Supposed to be seeing from. It seems to happen all the time, right? We'll look at some examples here in a second of even the forefathers, Abraham and Jacob. They're both polygamists. So you see it happening throughout the Old Testament. Why is that the case? When we get to the New Testament, it seems pretty clear that one of the requirements for elders in the early church is a husband of one wife, right? Can only have one wife, just a man and a woman, right? It seems pretty clear. So why does this exist? Why is there polygamy in the Old Testament? Well, it seems here that God permits polygamy in the Old Testament. It is clearly not his original design, and it doesn't seem to ever go well. Right? Like that's one of the clues sometimes, because I've had people bring this up before. I've go like, oh, well, if you Christians are so committed to like marriage, if marriage is such a big deal, man and a woman and all that stuff, and you don't want any deviation from that, then how come in the Old Testament you got all these polygamists running around? What's with that? How come that's a good thing in the Old Testament? It's not. It's not a good thing in the Old Testament. And all you have to do is actually read the stories to go, it doesn't go well, right? God's providing just evidence that this is not a good plan, right? He's just showing it clear. He's allowing it to happen, but it doesn't go well for anybody. A very similar parallel that we see from this situation of Elkanah and Hannah and Peninnah is Abraham and Sarah. Right? Abraham and Sarah, they have trouble conceiving a child, right? They can't seem to have a child. They're dealing with infertility. And their solution is to bring in a second wife. We see this in Genesis 16, verses 1 through 6. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, those are their names before God changes them to Abraham and Sarah. Before that, it's Sarai and Abram. Most of the time, I'm going to say Abraham and Sarah. But when I'm reading this, I'll read it as it's written. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. She had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, behold now, but Yahweh has prevented me from bearing children. Go in to my servant, that it may be that I shall obtain children by her. And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. And so after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to Abram, her husband, as a wife. And he went in to Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on with contempt on her mistress. And Sarai said to Abram, may the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my servant to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me. But Abram said to Sarai, behold, your servant is in your power. Do to her as you please. Then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she fled from her. And honestly, it goes on from there. I think that's enough to see that it's not going well. And like, what a nightmare for Abraham, right? That it's Sarah's idea. Okay, if I can just like defend it, Abraham shouldn't have done it. But if I can defend him for a little bit here, it's Sarah's idea. She says, hey, how about you take my servant Hagar as your second wife? And Abraham's like, you say so, honey, right? And they do it. She conceives. And then what is the big offense? I guarantee you Abraham did not notice, okay? Because she looked at her bad. She looked on her with contempt. She gave her a dirty look. Right? She looked at her wrong. What? Guys, I guarantee you, none of the men in this room they could have been standing right there. They wouldn't have known that it happened. And then Sarah gets mad at Abraham. What? Like, because she looked at her wrong. And then she says to Abraham, like, this wrong that is done, that's on you, buddy. And he's like, what does he do? He's like, I'm out. Like, you do whatever you want. You do whatever you want with her. Like, Abraham's not right here, right? He shouldn't have done it. He should be more active. He should have solved this problem. There's all kinds of things he should have done better. And honestly, like, this is way too much to break down. But point being, like, what a mess, right? This is not a picture of like, oh, God clearly blessed polygamy. No, it doesn't go well. In the same way, it's not going well for Elkanah and his wives. It didn't go well for Abraham and Sarah and Hagar. In contrast, Abraham's son Isaac and Rebekah, his wife, also had fertility issues. We read about it in Genesis 25, 20 through 21. Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel, the Aramean of Padan Aram, the sister of Laban the Aramean, to be his wife. And Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife because she was barren. And the Lord granted his prayer, and Rebekah, his wife, conceived. Notice, Isaac is faced with the same problem as his father, the same problem that Elkanah would be faced with years from then. And his solution is to pray. He prays for his wife, and he trusts in however God will answer that prayer. And she conceives. Problem solved. He doesn't try to take this issue into his own hands. So we see a contrast there between these two. And then we see Jacob, Isaac's son. Jacob, Isaac's son, he also becomes a polygamist, though not entirely by his own choice, right? He gets kind of tricked into it. But again, that also doesn't go great. They have conflict there. What we should see in this overall, like, I guess the most literal thing to take from it is like, don't be a polygamist. But I don't think anyone was thinking of it. So that is not that revelatory. But here's what I think we can take from it overall. And if we go pull back a little bit and look at more broadly, how does this apply to our lives? Is that this is something that God is permitting, right? He's saying, like, yeah, you shouldn't go and just be promiscuous, go be with whoever in the Old Testament at this time. But in that culture at that time, to get married to more than one person, if it's still marriage, if they're still committed, they're not just running around on each other, everyone's aware of what's going on, he's allowing it to happen. It's not his design, and it doesn't go well. But he's allowing it to happen. He's permitting it. But just because God permits something doesn't mean he has something better in mind. And we should want God's best for our lives, not just what he's willing to permit. But so oftentimes, that's what we shoot for. So oftentimes, we shoot for, like, what can I get away with? Right? What will God allow me to get away with? Technically, if I do this, am I technically breaking anything in the Bible? I've had people ask me that kind of question. Like, okay, this is what I want to do. Is there anything in the Bible that says I can't? Right? Is there anything in the Bible that says I can't do this thing? Because this is what I would really love to do this, and I think this is going to solve my problems. Is there anything in the Bible that says I can't? Technically. Let's get technical. Technically. Is there anything that says I can't do it? And I'll like, well, I don't think it's a good idea, but no. Okay, I'm going to do it. That's not what our goal should be. Our goal should not be to try to work around and figure out, like, how can I get away with this thing so that I can get what I want, right? It should be, God, what do you want from me? What do you want for my life? Because I want what you want. I want God's best for me, and I don't want to just get away with what I can get away with. I don't want just what God will permit. I want what is best for my life. And I think that's what we see from this overall passage, this overall issue throughout the Old Testament about polygamy is there's people getting away with what God will permit for them, but it's not his best design. And we should want his best design for our lives. We'll look next here at verses 9 through 18. After they had eaten and drunk in Shiloh, Hannah rose. Now Eli the priest was sitting on the seat beside the doorpost of the temple of Yahweh. She was deeply distressed and prayed to Yahweh and wept bitterly. And she vowed a vow and said, O Yahweh of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your servant and remember me, and not forget your servant, but will give to your servant a son, then I will give him to Yahweh all the days of his life, and no razor shall touch his head. As she continued praying before Yahweh, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was speaking in her heart, only her lips moved, and her voice was not heard. Therefore Eli took her to be a drunken woman. And Eli said to her, How long will you go on being drunk? Put your wine away from you. But Hannah answered, No, my Lord, I am a woman troubled in spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I have been pouring out my soul before Yahweh. Do not regard your servant as a worthless woman, for all along I have been speaking out of my great anxiety and vexation. Then Eli answered, Go in peace, and the God of Israel grant your petition that you have made to him. And she said, Let your servant find favor in your eyes. Then the Lord went away. Then the woman went her way and ate, and her face was no longer sad. So as a family, they finished their meal. And although we know that Hannah didn't eat, but everyone else is done eating. So Hannah gets up, she leaves the table, she goes back to the temple, and she kind of falls down there at the temple gates and just prays desperately. Or she's pouring her heart out to God and asking him to remember her and to give her a son. And then she makes this vow. Right? She makes this promise to God. She says, if you give me a son, I will give him to your service all the days of his life. She's essentially saying, you give me a son, I'll give him back. If you give me a son, I'll give him back to you. He can go and work for you in the temple, but I just want to have a son. If you give him to me, I'll give him back. And what she's saying is, from an early age, like as soon as he's able to be weaned, he's going back to be raised by the priests in the temple and to work there and to serve there the rest of his life. But she's willing to do this. She's asking God desperately for this. She promises to give them to him all the days of his life. And she also promises no haircuts. Right? She says no razor shall ever touch his head. It's an interesting promise to make. What she's doing there is promising to give him that he will take on the vow of the Nazarite vow. And the Nazarite vow includes a couple different things. And it was the way that someone in Israel would dedicate themselves to God's service, right? So sometimes even for a temporary amount of time, 10 years, whatever, some amount of time, they would dedicate themselves to God's service. And to do that, they would initially shave their head, but then for the duration of their service, they would not cut their hair at all. And so that's what she's referring to when she says no razor shall touch his head. She's saying from the very beginning, he will be dedicated to you. So he will never get a haircut his entire life. He will go and serve you from the day he's born. But the Nazarites would also swear off alcohol. They wouldn't drink any alcohol. And you can read the vow of the Nazarite in Numbers chapter 6 if you're interested in looking it up. But not drink any alcohol, no wine or strong drink, and then not even anything that comes from the vine whatsoever. They want to know gray area, and so you're also not allowed to even eat grapes if you're a Nazarite. No eating grapes. And then the Nazarite would also vow not to have any contact with a dead body. So they couldn't have any contact with a dead body whatsoever, not even for a close family member, not even for their mother or father. And if the Numbers chapter 6 passage really breaks it down very detailed, that even provides a provision that if someone dies next to you unexpectedly, just like boom, they died you didn't have time to get away. They just died. That's okay. You just have to shave your head again and start from the beginning. Start over. So Hannah is promising that her son would, if God would grant her a son, would take on this vow of the Nazirite. Now, she's not alone. She thinks she's alone, but Eli the priest, he's there hanging out by the temple. He's kind of sitting outside of the temple, and he sees her there, and he mistakes her desperation for drunkenness. Now, I think that tells us something about the state of Israel. I mentioned that Israel was at a low point religiously. That tells us, I think, something. I think that's a little hint of that he's just like sitting out in front of the temple. So first of all, he's sitting, right? He's the priest. He's just sitting there because there's not a lot going on. There's not a lot of business, not a lot of sacrifices happening. So he's just sitting there waiting. He sees her weeping and crying on the steps of the temple. And his first assumption is, she's drunk. Now, I think that tells us that that's not the first time he's seen a drunk woman on the steps of the temple. Right? Because that wouldn't be your first assumption. Right? That wouldn't be my first. If someone showed up here on the steps of the church and was very upset, crying there, I would not assume that they were drunk, right? I would assume that they needed prayer or something, right? That I would go talk to them, assuming that they needed some kind of help. But I think this tells us things are not going well, and Eli does not typically get people who are there sincerely. He thinks she's drunk, so he tells her, like, get out of here, stop drinking wine, stop being drunk, get out, go. And she tells him, she explains herself. No, I'm desperate, right? She pours herself out even to him, right? She says, I'm a woman troubled in spirit. I've drunk neither wine nor strong drink, been pouring my soul before Yahweh. Do not regard your servant as a worthless woman, for all along I've been speaking out of my great anxiety and vexation. Right? She breaks herself down so clearly. And then look at Eli's response. Right? So she is being very candid, right? She's being very vulnerable with him, saying, I'm troubled in spirit. I was speaking out of my anxiety and vexation, right? She is bearing her soul to Eli. And he's the priest. And what does he say? He says, go in peace. The God of Israel grant your petition that you've made to him. That's pretty dismissive, right? Eli's an interesting character, right? He's not outright evil, and then we'll see as we go on, and you can judge for yourselves. We can see what we think by the end, because he will die. Another spoiler alert, he does die in the first couple chapters. We'll see what we think of him by the time he dies, but I mean, she really is telling him, I'm troubled in spirit, all this stuff, and he says, go in peace, and hope God grants your prayer. Right? He does not really give her much. He's kind of just unimpressive overall, right? He seems to be a passable priest, but he definitely lacks zeal, right? Hannah has this active, deep faith, and she's telling him all about what her problems are and what she's been doing in prayer, and he just kind of sends her away. We'll also see as we go on that he's not a good father, but in any case, she pours herself out to God, and then she seems to be satisfied, right? Like she tells God everything that's going on with her, and she pours herself out, and she makes this vow, and then her problem's not solved, right? She doesn't walk away from the temple pregnant, right? Her problem is the same, but she's poured herself out, and she seems to now be okay, right? She eats, and she isn't sad anymore, right? She went her way, she ate, seems to go back to her plate and eats the food that was given to her, and her face is no longer sad. Why? Why did that work? Because she has a sincere faith, right? She has a real active relationship with Yahweh. She trusts him, and she's ready to be content with whatever the results might be, right? She knows that she poured everything she is out to him. She told him everything that she's feeling. She asked for what she wanted, and now she's ready to be content with the results. She's at peace. We'll look lastly here at verses 19 through 20. They rose early in the morning and worshiped before Yahweh. Then they went back to their house at Ramah. And Elkanah knew Hannah his wife, and Yahweh remembered her. And in due time Hannah conceived and bore a son, and she called his name Samuel. For she said, I have asked for him from Yahweh. So Elkanah and his family go home, and Hannah conceives and bears a son. But it doesn't seem to happen overnight. Notice it even says in due time. Right? It's not something that happens that quickly. It isn't even necessarily in the first couple months when they get back, but in due time, eventually it happens. And Hannah names him Samuel, which means name of God. And ultimately, see, Hannah got what she wanted. Right? Hannah got what she wanted. She had a son. But she made a vow. Right? She had vowed that she would give this son back to God for his service. And for all the days of his life, right? This isn't something that Samuel can do on weekends. Right? This is something that she's going to give him away as soon as he's ready to be weaned, which is longer than in our day. People would nurse their children for a longer amount of time than we do. But as soon as he's ready to be weaned, he's meant to go to the temple and be raised by the priest. And this is not, again, they don't live next to the temple. She's not going to see him every day. He's going to go and be raised by the priests. So next week, we'll see if she follows through on her promise. I'll wrap up with this. How should we then live? 3 takeaways for today's message. Number 1, seek God's best for your life, not just what he will permit. It's so much better when we desire to live as he wants us to live and not just what we think would be best and what we think God will allow us to do. Number 2, don't be afraid to pour your heart out to God, to really tell him everything. I think sometimes when we're feeling anxious or afraid or angry, we try to hide those emotions from God, but he wants us to truly pour ourselves out to him. And then lastly, be ready to fulfill your promises to God. Again, I think sometimes people make promises to God kind of hastily, like, oh God, if you just come through for me in this thing, then I'll do what I'll serve you in some way, or I'll go to church every week, or I'll start reading my Bible, or whatever it might be. If we make promises to God, we should fulfill them and be ready to fulfill them. And we'll see if Hannah does next week. I'm going to pray here in just a second, and then we'll take communion together. After that, we'll sing one final song. And then if you'd like prayer for anything, there'll be some folks up here who would love to pray for you. You can come up and hear from them. Have them pray for you. Would you bow with me now? Heavenly Father, we thank you for your word. We thank you for this story of Hannah and her desire and the fact that she demonstrates so well how we can pour ourselves out to you and trust that you love us and that you know what's best for us. I pray that we would want your best for us and not just what we think would make us happy and that we can get away with. Father, may we put our trust in you more and more every day. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.